Hello, I'm Ed Gordon. On behalf of the Black Coalition Against COVID and its partner organizations nationwide, I want to welcome everyone to Making It Plain, a town hall on understanding the COVID-19 vaccine. We want to thank our partners, Howard University College of Medicine, Morehouse School of Medicine, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, Meharry Medical College, the National Medical Association and its affiliated W. Montague Cobb NMA Health Institute, the National Black Nurses Association, blackdoctors.org, and the National Urban League. Almost a year into the pandemic, the virus is raging across our nation. 250,000 Americans and counting have died, more than 10 million infected, and those numbers are rising. African Americans are suffering disproportionately. And the virus, well, the political nature has further complicated our national response. Both Pfizer and Moderna have announced that their clinical trials are meeting with success. But there are still a great many questions. How sound is the science? Has the vaccine's safety and effectiveness been measured against underlying health conditions that disproportionately impact African Americans? How will the vaccine be disseminated and to whom? Who gets the priority? And what of the well-documented racial bias in the American healthcare system? How do we ensure that Black health does not become an unintended casualty of the battle to defeat COVID? And most pressing of all, will our community accept a proven and safe and effective vaccine? And what are the consequences if we do not? We'll talk about all of this and more. COVID is real. It is devastating. It may, in fact, be the biggest public health challenge of our lives. But we could be on the threshold of a recovery. Today's discussion offers hope, clarity, and some practical steps forward. To get us started, I want to introduce the president and CEO of the National Urban League, one of our key partners in all of this. Please welcome Mark Morial.
Thank you, Ed Gordon. You're the best, and we appreciate you for what you do. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you who joined us today for this very important conversation. And some say that 50% of the game and 50% of the victory is showing up. We must show up to defeat COVID and restore our communities. And this conversation today is about how we can do that. Now, you know that for many great American cities, including my hometown of New Orleans, this pandemic has been devastating. New York, New Orleans, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Chicago, and I could continue on. The number of deaths, the number of infections, the way in which it has affected the very essence of our lives. It's been a tragedy. But now we must fight back and we must turn the corner. The Black Coalition Against COVID has been formed to bring together the National Urban League and a number of Black physicians and scientists and healthcare professionals who share the very same goal, and that is to defeat COVID and to ensure that the next steps in this process, which are about the deployment of a vaccine, are done in a way that does not embrace the systemic racism of the past. So let me tell you what our thinking is as to how we do that. First of all, the Black medical community, the deans of the 4 Black schools of medicine, the NMA, blackdoctors.org, and many, many others have come together to ensure that any vaccine green-lighted by the government is safe and effective for Black communities. We want to especially thank Peter Marks, who has been a great ally of the Black medical community, and he is the ultimate decision maker on the safety and efficacy of a vaccine. And he's going to work closely with the Black medical community to ensure that, in fact, we are clear that this vaccine is safe and effective, and especially so for Black communities. Number two, we have to ensure that any plan of distribution is broad, it's inclusive. What do I mean, and how do we do that? We need churches, community centers, schools, libraries, and yes, Urban League affiliate offices. We have 90 across the nation in 36 states in the District of Columbia, are places where this vaccine is deployed. In the community, close to people, we need broad, inclusive distribution. We're going to work for that. We're going to ensure that. We're going to communicate that to the incoming Biden administration, even if the current leadership of our nation is not committed to that. We are committed to that, and we're going to work and we're going to fight for this. And that's why we're here today, to make it plain, to make it simple, to make it clear, and to have a conversation with each and every one of you to ensure that we defeat COVID and we do it together. So let the conversation begin, and thank you for joining us.
Now we want to welcome our first panel discussion, and it's an essential one. It's our take. Black health professionals speak out. These dedicated professionals have been on the front lines of protecting the health of Black Americans for generations, and they've been on the front lines of the COVID battle from the start. Joining us are Dr. Leon McDougall, who is the 121st president of the National Medical Association. Welcome, doctor. Next, we have Dr. Randall C. Morgan, Jr., who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cobb NMA Health Institute. And finally, Dr. Martha Dawson, an Associate Professor and the President of the National Black Nurses Association. I welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to get into something before we get into the questions about what I'm told you guys want to talk about, and that is what's being called a love letter to Black America. Anyone who wants to pick that up, give us a sense of what this is.
This letter speaks to our commitment to the Black community through service and fulfilling our missions of our organizations and helping to be a source of information in this time of misinformation.
So many of us are concerned, and that is so needed because beyond the idea of hearing about this vaccine, there are, as we know, just concerns in our community across the board. What would you guys say to alleviate some of those fears? Because quite frankly, they're going to be lingering until much of this information is ingested and believed.
Well, believe it or not, we have to rely on science. This is a virus that we are just discovering. And so in order to really treat this virus, we're going to have a vaccine. And so with that being said, we have to at least put out the right information. We'll have to address all of the myths that are out there, that this is something that's just going to go away. It's not just going to go away. And we know that. And the thing is, we have no way to treat this virus. So we have to rely on inventing something to really try to eliminate it or control it.
Dr. Morgan, what are the challenges in your mind to not only, quite frankly, realistically seeing if these vaccines will work in labs and in tests they seemingly have been there, but what's the biggest challenge in convincing people that it is to their best interest to when these vaccines hit the public to engage and to take them?
I think that the circumstances that we live in today have to be looked at very closely. I think it's important that we demonstrate trust and no longer simply describe or just deliberate over the distrust issues. And we have to understand that in the circumstances that we exist today, science will prevail. We are the trusted voices from our historically significant organizations that can help our population to see their way through this dilemma and subsequently build trust.
Let me throw this out to all of you. We're in the holiday season. We're seeing so many people not knowing the best way to approach it, wanting to see their loved ones, yet wanting to be safe. What are you telling people, particularly those who, for example, may be waiting on results back? It's not a rapid test. In some cities, you're waiting 3 and 4 and 5 days. What are you telling people to alleviate the anxiousness that we're all feeling?
Well, I would say during this upcoming holiday period, that we should really reflect back on how am I going to help my family if I'm bringing COVID-19 to the family? And with this available technology we have, you got FaceTime, you got Zoom, you got Skype, all these technological advances, we should take advantage of them just as we've asked people to take advantage of them in regards to their worship services at church.
People have to understand that we have to take care of each other. And if you end up gathering, you have to at least accept the responsibility that you could be prematurely causing someone's death. Because as I stated earlier, we have no treatment. There is no cure for this disease. And so you have to be concerned about the younger members of your family, because they may have a longer life, but we don't know what this is going to be in the future. One of the things I've been telling and my members have been sharing with people is that when you look at the total number of people that have been infected in the United States, that means that many people now have a pre-existing condition. And we don't know what's going to be some of the outcome of that pre-existing condition until somewhere in the future.
Dr. Morgan, it's important for us to understand, human nature and what they're calling the pandemic fatigue. We understand that people are getting antsy, and when they're hearing that these vaccines may have a 90+ success rate, people start to let their guards down, and we're starting to see those numbers kick up across the nation because of that. What do you tell people with understanding that you don't want to beat them down anymore, but as Dr. Dawson just suggested, we've got to be realistic about where we sit right now?
Well, that's a very good point. And what I tell people is that the reality is that we don't know when the pandemic is going to end. We've had positive news the past week or two. Actually, the middle generation children, for instance, my children, are very concerned about their parents and others' parents. And so all the types of celebrations that people were thinking about having are being canceled. And everybody is just getting into a mode of taking this virus seriously. But I do think that the advent of the vaccine intervention may help us to get past the fatigue.
Dr. McDougall, let me ask you in relation to what we have to start understanding. I have very learned friends, people who quite frankly should know better, who've been following this along the way. And we all tend to do this, seemingly justify actions that are not as safe as they should be. These aren't uninformed people. What do we tell us all, quite frankly, and I'll include myself in that all, to say that we've got to be more realistic? I mean, that's how a pandemic survives, with the idea of, oh, well, but it ain't that bad. I can do X, Y, or Z. But if you were telling someone else, you would say, don't do X, Y, and Z.
Another great question, Ed. And so I would say, look to Africa. So when we speak to this African diaspora, many times we as African Americans feel that we need to be the example or take the lead or have a higher income and so forth as far as living. When you look at COVID-19, the continent of Africa and countries within Africa, they're doing better than us. So most of those countries, their citizens are wearing masks. So I say, look to Africa.
Dr. Dawson, let me ask you the same thing. You know, what do we tell people, even those who should know better, who are following it daily, but just not always doing the prudent thing?
I think one of the things that people have to do is accept personal responsibility. If I'm not going to do it for myself, at least do it for the other person. Because if I'm wearing a mask, I'm protecting you. But if you're not wearing a mask, you are exposing me. So if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for the next person. Look at the news. What is happening now? Hospitals, again, are running out of beds. They don't have the ICUs. And I was just talking to a young colleague of mine on yesterday, and he was telling me, my hospital is getting ready to put in the policy to say, these are the criteria that we're going to use to decide who's going to be placed on a ventilator and when those individuals are going to come off of a ventilator. There was another young nurse this weekend that was having a conversation with ABC, and she made the statement that they're down to doing what they call a 6-minute resuscitation. Okay, that's only 3 rounds, 2 minutes each. And Dr. McGougal and others know we will do a CPR for an hour, but we cannot afford to do that. We have to think about the healthcare workers who are tired, the physicians and the nurses, you know, and when they say we're doing CPR, but we cannot bag the patient, meaning that they don't have the mask on breathing for the patient, because then that exposes everyone else. I mean, this is serious business. So if you need to, have a conversation with someone in that healthcare space and allow them to help to educate you.
Dr. Morgan, I think one of the reasons that what we're doing here today is so important is the media hasn't always given the idea of how dire this can be. Certainly in the midst of it, when it really ramped up, we saw that. But so many people, including the President of the United States, has made it seem like it's just a bad cold, the flu, et cetera. Yet, as Dr. Dawson just suggested, we are at times in a triage situation like you see in war, depending on who you're going to resuscitate, who you're going to put on a ventilator, who you're going to let die, quite frankly, in very stark terms. Do we have to do a better job of explaining to everyone that you might get lucky and have a mild case, but it is a toss of a coin as to whether or not you find yourself in the hands of someone else making that decision?
Yes, I think we have to do that. But as I think about it, we really need to, as individuals, think about our own circumstances, our own demographics, where we live, what the trends are in our community. And we have to try to make changes that are going to be safe for us in our particular community. And by that, I mean, if there's an absence of overall national leadership, which absolutely indicates what we all know, that wearing a mask is the greatest deterrent to this particular virus, then we have to, if we're in certain communities where people freely do not wear masks, we have to isolate ourselves more. We literally have to quarantine ourselves from our community in order to be safe, because we understand that if we get this virus, particularly those of us who are seniors, it's a one-way ticket sometimes. So we have to take a greater amount of control of our own lives and try to spread that throughout our communities and certainly our families.
Dr. McDougall, Talk to me, if you will, about those who are facing in their states perhaps a second lockdown, certainly a scale back of what people were getting used to. And of course, it is an inconvenience, not only a societal inconvenience, but it may be a detrimental inconvenience to your household, i.e. money not coming in and the like. Give a sense of how important it is to find balance here in making money, paying your bills, and quite frankly, just living through this.
The National Medical Association, the National Black Nurses Association, we collaborated with the Rainbow Push Coalition and published a COVID-19 Public Health Manifesto, which you can look up online, and it provides recommendations for persons in communities to stay safe. So washing of hands, physical distancing 6 feet apart, and really stay away. I don't really like the term social distancing. I prefer physical distancing because we need to stay connected as people.
Let me ask you all, Dr. Dawson, I'll start with you as a closing thought of what you would like people to take away for the next 6 months as we move into a new year. At the beginning of this pandemic, so many people thought, oh, if we can just reach 2021, we're going to be okay. This is going to dance into 2021 with us. What would you like people to know and understand as they look to the next few months?
First, accept the fact that this is not a myth. This is real. And if we are going to survive, we're going to need to do our part in this. We can't say this is going to magically disappear. It's not going to happen. The things that we have put in that manifesto that we just mentioned is that you have to do the common things: washing your hands, wearing a mask, being physically distant from each other, but not socially distant from each other. Reach out to others with like-mindedness and listen to the advice of trusted individuals. I think what you all are doing here today is trying to get our voices out there to our people in our community to say, trust us. The National Black Nursing Association, we're in 35 states. You can find us somewhere. Go online. If you need to call us, we will reach out to you. We will tell you the right things to do and how to do those things. And for example, if I'm living in a family and it's a multi-generational home, yes, I may have to make some plans and really have conversations with my family about what's going to happen. No, I'm not just going to let my teenagers run out to the mall, because grandmother is also living in this household with me. But yes, mother and father are going to go to work because we still need to have income to survive. But you have to have those crucial conversations. And this is the time to have serious sit-down family conversation about survival.
Dr. Morgan, I'll ask you the same thing.
Yes, I think that we, the three of us, are fortunate to represent our historically significant African-American healthcare organizations. And as such, we are and have demonstrated that we are the trusted voices. And fortunately for our population, we can provide honest, trusted information, good science that will encourage them to keep the faith and to continue with all of the recommendations that have been discussed in the manifesto and otherwise, because a brighter day will come. And I do believe that the vaccine progress will help. It will help, but it also is a challenge for many of us, and particularly African Americans, who may have had a dilemma about whether they were actually going to utilize the vaccine. And so the real take-home message is that it looks that we are going to see progress. This is still going to be a long haul, and we have possibilities of altering the course, but we must believe in science and we must believe in our trusted voices in order to get to the destination.
Could I also speak to quickly? So the National Medical Association has convened a COVID-19 task force, and we're looking at the data. We're meeting with Pfizer. We have a third meeting on Friday. We're meeting with Moderna. We're meeting with AstraZeneca. So we want to serve as a bridge of interpretation concerning any determination by the Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization. I just wanted to get that in, Ed.
And as I give you the last word, it's interesting that you talk about the FDA and the idea of meeting with the companies that, let's be honest, also have profit in front of them if this works. But the reality is we're not 2 or 3 days away from administering this vaccination nationwide, because as you say, it still has to go through the FDA, get the approval there and move forward. Again, what do you tell those who may in fact be anxious, may be fatigued, maybe questioning whether or not this is going to work? Because there are a lot of people who are just, quite frankly, as I talk to them day to day, afraid to a great degree. What do you tell those folks?
So one, I will take the vaccine. 2, I've enrolled to participate in a vaccine clinical trial. 3, we're speaking to the community, clergy, professional organizations. We're also collaborating with Links Incorporated. So we're reaching out through our network and across 35 states and U.S. Virgin Islands, 120 state and local chapters, and the patients we serve. So we're in those communities practicing, and we're going to speak to our community.
With the National Black Nursing Association, we also have many of our nurses that are on a lot of the national committees. So they are working also with Pfizer and some of the other pharmaceutical companies, but they're also working with CDC. They're sitting on some of the vaccine, national committees at this time, talking about, so how we're going to push this out. What type of information are we going to release? Just last week, we actually had a think tank with National Black nurses and nurses from around the country, talking about the vaccine, talking about what information we need to get out to the public, and also asking ourselves those same critical questions. Are we going to be able to say, yes, I'm going to take the vaccine? I will tell you, for many of those within healthcare, we're not going to have a choice, because the places where we work, as you keep hearing on the news, they want the healthcare workers to take it first, because they know that we're going to be exposed to it the most. And the fact they want us to be available to work. So for example, I've already had my flu shot. I'm trying to tell other people, don't wait for the vaccine, at least go ahead and get your flu shot, So we have to be prevented. And honestly, it didn't do anything to me. I didn't feel any way. I was still up and moving about. So again, we have to use ourselves as examples sometimes. But the key thing is that I know I've already heard people say, but they're saying it's going to be 90 to 95% effective. I'm saying I would prefer to take the 90 to 95% chance with the vaccine of contacting COVID and then not have a hospital bed to go to.
Yeah, it's important that we look at the numbers and continue. Doctors Dawson, Morgan, McDougall, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Before we move to our next panel, take a look at these facts. Now on to our next panel. We're calling it Vaccine 101. There are so many hopes that come with the news of a possible COVID vaccine, but there are also fears following months of illness, lockdowns, and frustration, circumstances worsened by partisan politics. To move forward with confidence, all of us should know the science behind the vaccine. Our 4 Black medical schools, in partnership with all of our coalition members, are committed to keeping the community informed and making the science behind the who, what, when, where, and how of the vaccine available and known to you. Joining us now, Saheem Mahjoub, doctor with the Howard University College of Medicine, Dr. Lily C. Immergluck, representing Morehouse School of Medicine, and Dr. David M. Carlisle, coming to us from the Charles R. Drew University and Medicine and Science. I welcome you all. Thanks so much. Let me start with you, Dr. Mahjoub, if I may. The idea of so much being talked about right now about these promising vaccines, but we're not at a cure-all state. What do you want people to know about being cautious of what they're hearing right now?
So thank you, Mr. Gordon. Very nice to be on your program. I just want all people, and this is what I tell my patients in the clinic, I want everyone to listen to the science. So it's very important to listen to, good resources. There are different resources, Center for Disease, CDC. So avoiding just following information from social media. So you want to ask your physicians, you want to go to really scientific resources to get the right information.
Dr. Carlisle, same question to you. So many people have fatigue right now. They're looking for anything, quite frankly, to cure this, even if the numbers that we're seeing are true, 90+% positive rate. We're still a long way from everyone receiving the vaccine, and the caveat that some people just won't take it, as some don't take a flu shot.
Yes, and I think it's important to recognize that we're dealing with a clear and present danger here, something that we didn't even know about a year ago. And our response to COVID-19 has been historic. But I'm reminded of driving down the highway. You do everything that you can to prevent a car accident. You're staying awake, you're driving within the speed limit, you're keeping space in front of the car in front of you. But all of a sudden, people lose control in front of you and you're headed into a car accident. At that point, the only thing that you have going for you will be your seatbelts and your airbags. A vaccine is like a seatbelt and an airbag against COVID-19. Despite everything else, we still need these vaccines.
Dr. Immergluck, are you concerned? We're seeing growing numbers in almost all of the states across this country. There is a sense of people becoming more relaxed as time goes on, in spite of these numbers, and also becoming more relaxed because their assumption is, well, if I get sick, vaccine's on the way. There is a want for us to understand that this nirvana that people keep thinking about just isn't here. I'll ask you to double what Dr. Carlisle said there.
Yes, and I understand and appreciate the fatigue as we move forward through this vaccine. And if anything, the fact that there are candidate vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 that seem very promising, I think should give us all hope. But I would say to the folks that this is a science that we're learning with every passing minute, and that's why we have to stay vigilant. We have to stay attuned to the science as it changes, because, in the early phase of the pandemic, we thought that, folks who had comorbidities or the elderly were the ones that were most impacted, which remains true, but we're also seeing that younger folks are also impacted, children, young adults. And now the concern now that we have many folks who have had COVID, we can start seeing the after effects of what we call long COVID syndrome. So these are folks who got acute infection and got over it, and now we're seeing some of those manifestations. So this knowledge, the science, this information is continually changing, and we have to move with that change. So I would tell people who are fatigued to stay with us.
Let me ask all of you to address this, and that is that this nation, this president, quite frankly, and you can argue whether he's done the right thing or not across the board, but one of the things that he did suggest is he wanted these companies to move with all deliberate speed to find an antidote. Are you at all concerned that perhaps we've moved too fast? I mean, this has been lightning speed to create a vaccine. It has skipped some steps that you would normally go through, and we still should note, as we did earlier in the program, it still has to be approved by the FDA. But what of those who have concerns that we've moved a bit too fast? I'll throw that out to all of you.
So I just wanted to reassure the public that we are moving fast because it's a pandemic. So it's a very unusual situation. But at the same time, I want to reassure the public and people is that even though we're going at a very fast speed, but everything is still being reviewed very rigorously by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So all these protocols for clinical trials are being reviewed. When participants are enrolled in the studies, they're going to be monitored very closely. So even though the phases have gone so fast, but that does not mean we're skipping anything that's usually done by the by the FDA.
I want to echo that because I have pause with the word skip, because I actually think we didn't skip. I think that we have an unprecedented situation that has called an unprecedented group of folks from the federal government, from academia, from the pharmaceutical industries to pull together and make all of us kind of all hands on deck work to try to come up with a solution that will help prevent further disease.
Let me change that, Doctor, and you can pick up on your point if you like. Skip may have been the wrong word. We're not skipping steps as much as though, let's be honest, we are truncating these steps and moving a lot faster in the trial in and of itself. So I take your point and correct that, but it is very much truncated, and we are seeing what may have taken X number of months and further study, down to weeks or what have you.
But part of that is because we have many more sites involved. If you look at historically some of the vaccine development that has come, whether it's influenza or some of our childhood vaccines, those take years because it's, a company going and trying to accrue the participants singly out there. What we have here is a situation where we have many sites lobbying to get those participants up to the 30,000, the 45, 60, in these phase 3 trials. So truncating, I'm not even sure that is the best word I would think of. We have really put a lot of resources to try to get an acceleration of the recruiting of participants to be involved in these studies so we can get the data at the numbers that we need in order for us to define whether or not these vaccines are efficacious or not.
Dr. Carlisle, what's your thought on that? I think as a layman, I would probably still argue with Dr. Irma Gluck whether or not we're doing some of what I suggest. But what's your thinking on that?
Yes, and let me be perfectly clear here. I have absolutely no concerns about where we are in terms of vaccine development. We are facing, again, a clear and present national emergency. People are dying every day. We need to turn this around and stop it from happening in order to save lives. This is why the term emergency use authorization is so relevant. We are facing an emergency. I have total trust in my scientific colleagues that they are developing these technologies very appropriately. We've certainly seen in certain areas slowdowns where necessary to review where we are in terms of vaccine development. Those slowdowns and even halts of some of the trials that have been resumed have been very appropriate. This is being done entirely in keeping with scientific principles. And again, we have to do something to save lives.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, the circumstance for whatever we're going to define it and call it, needs to accelerate what we've seen. So I think we all can agree on that. Let me ask this. When we hear these numbers from Pfizer and Moderna of 90 plus, what does that mean? What should a layman take from that number?
So I can take that question. So that number means that we found out, or the research found that vaccine is 95% efficacious, which what we want. We want to fight that virus as much as we can. So these numbers are very, very reassuring that because two things you're looking at with the vaccine, you're looking at if this vaccine will work, will it take care of what it was made for, and also if it's safe. So I'm sure these are the two things that in the mind of everyone that's listening to us or right now in the communities, they want to make sure that will that vaccine help me, and is that vaccine safe for me to take? So these are the things that we're looking at, and so far, the results have been very reassuring.
Should people of color look at those numbers of efficacy and the like and be confident in it? Because we know that disproportionately we won't be represented as we should, just based on the skittishness sometimes of the community to participate in something like this. Because I think about pregnant women or infants and the like have not been tested in the way they should. So how should people of color look at this?
Well, I think that's partly why we, the 4 HBCUs, had pulled together and made that pledge. I think if you think about the vaccine development and you think, is it safe? Is it going to be efficacious for preventing disease? And you look at who got vaccinated in these clinical trials, you wanted to be able to say it represents the people who are most affected. And so from that standpoint, I encourage folks to really look and ask themselves, do they want to be part of a vaccine trial, so that in the end, when these vaccines are available for the general public, we can say with some degree of certainty that these vaccine trials and the information we got from it reflects the population for whom I'm a part of, or people of color. And I just want to say for the Moderna, basically for that 95% there, 95 people got disease, and they looked at that. And of those people, 90 of them received the placebo, and 5 of them were vaccinated. And that's what makes it such a compelling reason to say that this vaccine seems to, on this interim analysis, looks like it is efficacious.
And is that an extraordinary number to come out at a first swing? I mean, that seems to be very high.
I think the extraordinary fact is that 2 separate vaccine candidates, the Pfizer and the Moderna, came with similar numbers independently when they're using the platform to develop this vaccine in a very similar way. So I think that, to me, as a scientist, as a physician scientist, it reassures me that it looks very promising as far as protection of people getting SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Dr. Carlisle, can you, because part of what we're trying to do here is make medical speak very plain to the layman, to allay their fears, if you will, or skepticism. Can you give a Cliff Notes version when we hear about these trials and the development of the vaccine, what goes on in it going from the lab to the trial to getting these numbers?
Yes, and I'm not a research immunologist or virologist. We have colleagues on the video who are closer to this than I am, but clearly there are 3 phases in these clinical trials. Phase 1, small safety test. Phase 2, expanded safety test. Phase 3, looking at efficacy. And when you see an efficacy number of 90-some%, that is an outstanding number. We have other vaccines that are much less effective than 90-some%, but we are using them today to prevent all sorts of conditions, including influenza. This is tremendously good news as we go forward in the fight against COVID-19. And I think we need to appreciate the work that's gone into this process so far, because it has been outstanding.
Dr. Mahjoub, let me ask you the same. Is there something that you can help folk understand? Because again, sometimes I have to be in my position, the wet blanket of all of this, in the sense of just being honest about what people need to hear. And I think about the years that the flu shots aren't always as effective, if you will, as previous years or future years. Give us a sense of what the test is and why people should be secure in that number.
Good. So I think, and this is what I'm also explaining to my patients in the clinic and my family and friends, is that, the results are very reassuring, but we also don't want to put our guards down. Like, we're going to start using these vaccines. This is going to be great. It's going to give us protection, but that does not mean like eventually we have to take off the masks. We have to, not do social distancing. So these are all going to be going hand in hand. So with the vaccines, it's like, so we don't know like how much immunity these are going to provide us. So this is why we're going to have monitoring of these of these participants. So listen to the science. This is going to be helping you, and if you have any hesitance, and this is what I talk to my young patients in the clinic. You're young. If you get the illness, you might not need hospitalization, but when you're refusing to participate in a clinical trial, think of your elderly mother, think of your elderly grandmother. These are the people who, when you come in with the illness, you're going to make these people very sick, and they can end up either hospitalized in an intensive care unit or even death. So taking the vaccine will prevent that, will protect you, and as well as protect your loved ones.
There's been talk, Dr. Irma Gluck, about who will receive it. Obviously, frontline workers are going to be, on that first list. They're talking about those who are, very vulnerable, if you will, those in convalescent homes and the like. Let me ask you, we still have to understand there is a lot to be learned too, because we won't know until it is effectively launched how long this immunity will last. I mean, there's just a number of questions that will go on. We have to understand that as well, do we not?
Yes, and just to emphasize the point of the durability, we're still trying to, this is an interim analysis. And so this is saying, what, we saw that it does seem to protect people from getting infected. But what does that mean in the long run? Each participant that goes in these trials, they are followed for 2 years. And there's a reason for that. It's so that we can see and address the issue about durability. And when I say durability, I just mean like if you encounter the germ again, 6 months out, a year out, are you going to be protected? And that goes back to your question about the influenza vaccine. Influenza vaccine has been around for a while, and we've been able to say that the strain changes, and we try to predict that with every year, how that strain changes and how we might try to adapt to that with our vaccine. We're not able to do that right now with the COVID vaccine because we're in it. We're still in this pandemic. But as far as the priority groups, I think a lot of attention will be paid on that as far as who's going to be in the groups, because the vaccine availability is not at the point where we can provide it to everyone who's eligible in this country. So I think that conversation is going to have to play out. And I again, it provides from the interim analysis some protection from SARS-CoV-2 as we know it now.
Dr. Mahjoub, let me ask you, as relates to the impact nature of getting the virus under control by means of the vaccine, if in fact we look across this nation and still see so many who are refusing to wear masks, who have come out on the side of the administration to perhaps downplay the severity of this virus, in spite of the numbers of people, not only who are ill from this, but who are dying from this. What is your concern that those people, the likelihood of them even taking the virus or the vaccine rather, is there any concern? Because the impactful nature of the virus is only going to be seen by means of a vast majority of folks complying and getting the vaccine at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to definitely see people who are for sure anti-vax. There are people who are just hesitant to take the vaccine because they are concerned about safety. So these are the people that we need to target and educate. So what I spend a lot of my time in the clinic educating my patients in the clinic. The other thing is we as healthcare workers, we were trained to deal with death. So these are all the stories I tell my patients and I tell my family and my friends. We were trained to deal with death, but with COVID, there has been so many deaths and losing young people during the surge between April and July. That was really, really when I decided, I said, we have to do something. We have to defeat this virus. The virus cannot defeat us. And one more thing that I explained to my patients in the clinic and also want our listeners to hear is that if you want to get a vaccine, you want to make sure that that vaccine has been researched in people like you, people of color, people who are working the hard jobs, people who work in condensed communities, people who live in condensed communities. You don't want to have a vaccine tested in people who don't represent you, and you still won't expect that vaccine will work on you. So this is the message that I repeatedly tell my patients and my friends and family.
I see all of you shaking your head, or the other two of you shaking your head in agreement there. Again, let us echo the importance of being a part of these trials. Dr. Emmer Gluck already, touched on the idea of people of color being sometimes skeptical based on the history of this nation. But from what I've done with this group and from what I've had, from the conversations, I should say, I've had with others personally in the medical community, there is a sense of really wanting people of color to be involved in these trials and making sure that you're doing apples to apples when doing these comparisons. Dr. Carlisle, I'll start with you, and then Dr. Emmer Gluck will have you chime in there.
Well, there's a phrase that was said to me that I'll share with you all and the viewers on this broadcast, and it's basically, if we don't test it, we won't take it. That's really how profoundly important participation in clinical trials is. We need to make sure that all of our target populations are involved, so that our populations will have the confidence that this vaccine is there for them. And that confidence is really important. This is where the historically Black medical schools, the minority serving institutions all come in, because we've learned how important our institutions are in getting the word out that you can have faith in medical science as delivered by our institutions. When we were doing COVID-19 testing in South Los Angeles, when people were coming in and they saw that the testers looked like them, they were students and people of color. They spoke their languages, Spanish and other languages. Confidence soared and testing rates went up. That's exactly what we're talking about here with vaccine development and implementation.
Give me a sense as we wind down here, what you would like people to take away beyond the obvious, beyond that this is helpful to the community. But there has to be a sense of hope, I think, based on what we have been through for almost a year now. Quite frankly, there is a loss of hope, getting back to some normalcy, some regularity. What do you tell people who have kind of lost that? I don't want to say shocked, but disheartened maybe with the number of conversations I have where people are just, we keep using the word fatigued, but I would say at a loss of hope at times on any given day. What do we tell them?
If I may, Ed, I'll cite the example of Churchill in Britain under the Blitz. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They thought they were about to be overrun in World War II, but they hung in there and they triumphed in the end despite enormous odds against them. The fact of the matter is that we're in our darkest hour right now with COVID-19. but we will get to the end of the tunnel. There's already a light there with the vaccination results. Every infectious disease that we've faced, we've often been able to overcome with scientific and vaccination technology. And that's where we stand right now with COVID-19. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. There will be a brighter day, and we are on the way to getting there.
And how concerned are you, before I let the other two doctors chime in, how concerned are you about the winter? You know, we keep hearing about the concern about colder months. Concern?
Yes, I remember a popular phrase, winter is coming. Winter is here right now. For all the reasons we've talked about, it's cold outside, people want to gather inside, the holidays are upon us. This is probably the most dangerous time that we're facing with COVID-19. And I would just ask that everyone be vigilant and protective of your loved ones, of your families, to make sure that we're doing everything possible to prevent additional spread of COVID-19.
Dr. Mahjoub, would you pick up and share your thoughts on the idea of first winter and what we need to be cognizant of, and then try to alleviate some of that angst that so many are feeling?
Sure. So for the winter, for everyone, continue to wear your mask, social distancing. Please, if you haven't taken the flu shot, please take the flu shot, because flu and COVID have some similar symptoms. So we'll make life much easier for your physician, and also to avoid going into the hospital if people don't know which one you have, or maybe you have both. And then that's a big problem. Then you're going to be sicker, especially our elderly, especially our people with comorbid condition, who are people of color usually, and people with healthcare disparity. As far as hope, I'm always a positive person and always think that it's going to get better. And like my colleague said, there is going to be light at the end of the tunnel. It has been long, but we shouldn't put our guard down. Consider seriously participating in a clinical trial, because we want our life back. It might take long, but it's going to happen one day, because we want to enjoy what we used to enjoy before. Going, seeing our loved ones without a mask, eating with them without a mask, it's going to happen. But I'm not telling people that once you get the vaccine, take your mask off. It's going to happen, but nice and slow. But I think I also tell people is that this pandemic might have happened for a reason, for us to be very united. Look out for each other, start new hobbies. If you feel the fatigue and you're tired and you're just, I can't do this anymore, think about new things, reach out to people, reach out to the elderly, and that will make you, give you a sense of gratification. You're helping someone, you're doing something different.
And let me take you, before I have Dr. Emma Gluck round us out here, back to the question of the flu shot. So someone like myself, I've never had a flu shot. I've been fortunate enough never to have the flu, but would you advise someone like me, who has never had a flu shot in all of my 60 years now, to take one this year?
I would, Ed, and please, after this program, call your primary care and go have it.
On the line, right?
Go have it, because, you know, I always tell my patients, they're like, oh, for 10, 20 years, I never had the flu shot. I never had the flu. I'm like, you know, the flu was kind to you, but you never know how long the influenza is going to be kind to you. It might be just this year, when we have the COVID, that you're going to have both. So please take your influenza vaccine. So this is my message, my daily message to my patients. The influenza has been really nice and kind to you, but it might not be this year.
Well, I can only hope my wife isn't watching this, because I will be at the doctor's office this afternoon for sure. Dr. Emma Gluck?
I was going to say, Ed, what I would say is I would go offline with you and ask you and try to work with you on understanding why you haven't taken the flu vaccine. And so that maybe we could come to a middle ground on that piece, so that you feel comfortable and you're not just, you know, oh, I'm going to go get the flu vaccine because I got pressured. But I do think
I say this quickly, just so, because I see myself in this spot, not as much as a journalist as I've been for, 3.5 decades or whatever it is. I see myself as a layman, asking the kinds of questions and thinking about how my friends talk about this. I just have never taken a flu shot because I never had the flu. I never really got sick. So in my mind, I, didn't see it as something, and I'm admitting this might've been foolish thought, and fodder for those of you who need to talk to people like me. But it just never entered my mind. It wasn't I was afraid of it. It wasn't that I thought, the government had some conspiracy. I just felt like, you've never had the flu. You see in your mind yourself as healthy, even though you may not be as healthy, certainly as your mind's eye tells you so.
And I would say to that is that, look, flu is definitely circulating, and we know it comes every year, right? But the problem is that this year, unlike other years, we've got this other super sticky germ floating around that's easily transmissible. So if you have the misfortune of getting it and then you get flu, that's just something that was preventable.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great note to end on, because the idea of just, hedging your bet and, being as protective as one can would be, I think, the best advice we all could give in this spot. I thank you all, greatly appreciate it, for explaining some things that, are sometimes mystical to so many people. Thank you all for joining us today. Greatly appreciate it. And we want to thank the universities for joining us and continuing the fight. Now, before we continue our next panel, here are some more important facts for you. How soon before we see the vaccine in our communities? And what will post-vaccine life be? Does anyone know? We want to get a vaccine update, if you will. Joining us now is Phyllis Arthur, Vice President of Infectious Disease and Diagnosis Policy at the Biotechnological Innovation Organization, or BIO. Also joining us, Dr. Peter Marks, Director, Center of Biologics Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I thank you both for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Phyllis, if I may start with you, would you take us through, and I asked this earlier, kind of a Cliff Notes version of what has been going on up until this point? I mean, people really got tuned in when they started to hear the numbers in the 90s of the possibilities of these vaccines, but what takes us from start to that point?
Oh, great question. So one of the things I think that's been most important about the response and the vaccines developed is we really are building these vaccines based on some great research that was already being done around other vaccines in the past. So many of the vaccines that you're seeing moving through the late phase development right now were actually being researched for other coronaviruses like MERS and SARS, or they were used for flu, or they were used for Ebola response, for example. So these vaccines are kind of standing on the platforms, as we call them, that have been used to research other vaccines. And one of the things that's so special about those vaccines as they're developed is they actually leverage, instead of getting the virus itself, the ability to actually understand the DNA of the actual vaccine, or the RNA of the vaccine. And you can go very quickly from knowing the virus itself to having an actual vaccine that you can start testing in animals and humans. So
let me stop you there just for a second.
Sure, absolutely.
Laymen will understand. So
Absolutely.
most folks have heard DNA. They'll understand what that is. But when you say RNA, that isn't as commonly known. So can you explain the difference to people?
And I certainly want to defer to the scientist on the phone to explain RNA, but maybe Dr. Marks, you can explain RNA more efficiently than I could.
Sure. So DNA is what it lets us transfer our genetic material from one generation to the next. RNA is kind of what helps us serve as the intermediary between our genetic material and making proteins. So it's kind of a step in the process. So it turns out that some viruses are DNA viruses, some viruses can be RNA viruses. And sometimes we can make therapeutics out of RNA as well, because the RNA then becomes a protein copy of what the RNA encodes.
So let me see if I can break it down even more, because one of the things that we want to make sure is that, again, lay people understand. So let me see if I can try this. Doctor, if DNA is the actual making of the cake, right? All the ingredients that make a cake, what would you then call RNA in that process?
Yeah, it's interesting way of thinking about it. DNA is actually like DNA is more like that recipe, the master recipe for the cake.
Okay.
It's got everything you need there in terms of the instructions, but you don't got no cake. You don't have a cake. You have all the instructions there. Everything, DNA has all the instructions for making the cake, but it's not the actual physical cake. Proteins are like the cake itself. And the RNA is like the work you do. It's like what translates that DNA into the cake.
So it becomes the baker, so to speak. You know,
you got it. It's like all that work you put in, and put into a physical structure. Exactly.
Okay. All right, Phyllis, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that was wonderful. And it was great to hear the analogy. I'm always looking for analogies to these kinds of things. So I think what we saw then was that companies were able to take what they knew about the genetic coding of this virus and actually very quickly go from an idea of a vaccine to a vaccine and start to test them. And so that's why you saw this very compressed timeline where we could start actually looking at certain vaccines in people. And that's one of the ways that we saved time without really cutting any corners, is really by leveraging this new science and new technology to go quicker towards having a vaccine to test. And across the board, even though the vaccines are different from each other, they all leverage that speed of development.
We should note that we are still some steps away, and we're going to get to Dr. Marks in a moment, because we're going to have to eventually, those companies, send it to the FDA for approval to get out to the masses. But there are those who will be concerned that, and we had this discussion earlier about the idea of, I said it was truncated, but the expedient nature of getting this out much faster than even the scientific community at first blush thought was possible raises some eyebrows in some corners. Give us a sense of why people should be secure, not only with the number, but that the steps that have been accelerated make people comfortable enough to say, okay, I'm going to give this a shot.
So I think that one of the things that's important to note is that companies actually did their clinical trials on top of each other. And that's one of the key ways they saved time, was not waiting, looking at each trial, making sure there were no safety signals to a trial. But when you got some data, actually moving to the next stage of a trial, working with the FDA closely to have all of your directions for the clinical trial ready to go, and then moving very swiftly to start recruiting to the next trial size, making decisions more rapidly about dosing. And then the guidance that the FDA gave industry actually helped industry put together those plans for their trials much more rapidly than if each company came to the FDA one at a time and had that discussion. So a lot of the time has been just about being much more efficient in us all doing the research in the same way, while still adhering to the gold standard of how you do vaccine research. So where we have not cut time is what you're measuring, counting safety, having a robust evaluation of what efficacy, what it means when we say it works. So we're actually using the same language to say, this is what I mean when I say you're protected or you're not protected. And those similarities across the vaccines are going to allow everyone to do their research in a much more direct way.
And we should note that even before it goes to the FDA, there are internal reviews that must go on with these companies. But there is still a concern I think I noted that, for instance, pregnant women, infants, small children, we don't know the outcome in terms of the numbers with that group. And there is a concern, obviously, with minorities, with people of color and the like. And that's part of why we're doing these town halls. Give me a sense, if you will, before I go to Dr. Marks, of what those internal review boards have been doing and what you'd like to see more of based on, people of color in our community's involvement in the trials that go on.
Absolutely. I think that the companies have made a very concerted commitment to have the broadest diversity possible. And they've defined diversity in an extremely wide way. So not just race, which is extremely important, as you mentioned, Ed, but gender, ethnicity, underlying conditions. For example, people who have well-controlled HIV can be in the trials. That's relatively unusual. We really need these products to be able to be given broadly. And companies have plans for children and pregnant women in trials that come after the clinical trials we're seeing now. I think what I would say to the folks who are watching is it's really important for us all to understand why our engagement as African Americans in the clinical trial process is so important, because in the end, while we're all the same, there are differences in our underlying conditions and how we respond to different products. And the more we can be involved in the clinical trial process, the better we'll feel about having the data we need to make a really good educated decision. And so companies really work closely with the COVID Prevention Network, the NIH, their clinical trial companies, really trying to make sure they had the highest numbers possible of people that really were being affected by COVID.
So Dr. Marks, let me turn to you. And again, using layman's terms, if you will, many people will see the FDA as kind of that last line of defense before it gets out to the people. Give us a sense of what are the steps for approval and making sure that you are comfortable and confident that this drug is safe enough for mass consumption.
So there's a little bit of a nuance here. And the nuance is that the first vaccine that's going to get out to people is going to not have the traditional type of full approval from FDA, which is called the biologics license application. It's going to have something called emergency use authorization, which is something that we can do more quickly in an emergency situation. Now, I'm going to try to simplify a lot down to a few words by saying that in this case, the difference for a vaccine between the emergency use authorization and the biologics license application, much of that will boil down to administrative things, because the key thing is that is going to be the same for both is that we're going to require the results from a large, well-controlled, randomized trial, such as what the companies have been doing, these 30 to 45,000 patient trials. And we're going to look over that data for either way. We're going to look over those data, make sure the data look good for efficacy, for safety, and also look at the manufacturers, their plans for how they're making those vaccines to make sure that they're really made of high quality. So quality, safety, and efficacy will all be reviewed. And whether it's done under an emergency use authorization or biologics license application, we're going to make sure that we check all the boxes for what we need to see. It's true, for a biologics license application, we would normally have some more safety follow-up data over time, but we're going to make up for that by using large safety surveillance systems to make sure that nothing comes out over time that we'd be concerned about. So we're taking these very, very seriously.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that these are so safe that we're very comfortable taking them ourselves, taking them with our families, and having anyone that we know in our country take them.
What's your biggest concern? I mean, as I've been following this, there was a concern. Moderna seems to have figured out a way in terms of keeping the temperature to keep, the efficacy solid for their drug. Pfizer had to keep it in these sub-zero temperatures that not everyone could efficiently use. There's the question of transportation. I mean, it's such a huge endeavor. We're enlisting the Army to be a part of all of this. What's your biggest concern when we talk about mass consumption?
You know, I'm going to say I'm not so concerned about the cold chain requirements because our colleagues in Africa showed us that they could overcome cold chain requirements really creatively. So I think we can take a page out of their book for that. I'm concerned that we all have enough confidence to be willing to take that vaccine, because unless we all feel confident, and about probably 70 or 80% of us are willing to have that vaccine who haven't had COVID before, we're not going to get to this place of having herd immunity. And what herd immunity means is that we have enough people that are immune that we essentially snuff out the ability of the virus to spread in our communities. So to me, the biggest thing that my job here and our folks at FDA, our job is to make sure that we do our jobs well enough and we do it with enough transparency so that people can see what we're doing, so that they have confidence to take these vaccines. And that means that everyone feels that the vaccines have been studied in people like them, so that they feel comfortable taking them. And that's why we'll make sure that we've had enough of various minority populations, older folks, and people with different conditions in these studies. And even though we won't have every last population like the children in these initial studies, those data we're going to try to get as quickly as we can.
You feel comfortable enough with where you sit with the involvement of people of color, particularly African Americans, in this stage of the trials, that when it is released, you will have had enough numbers to safely say this will be effective in your community?
Yeah, I think they did the community turned out very nicely and in both of these trials, I think it's public record that it's about 10% of the trials were enrolled with African American participants. I think about another 15-20% with Latinx. I might be off by a percent or two there, but there was, I think people turned out, and that's going to be important because that gives us the kind of numbers that we'd like to see. Remember that oftentimes for vaccine trials, the vaccine trials are only 6,000-7,000 people. Here, to get them done quickly, we're talking about a trial of 45,000 people. So if 10% is actually a pretty large number of people.
Yeah, well, certainly we'll continue to watch this, and we are all watching with bated breath, and those who are inclined to say prayers are doing so. So I thank you both for, being a part of what is such an important front line for all of us. We were talking earlier about the idea that this is very serious, and we can't let our guard down, whether it be fatigue or whether you feel more comfortable because the vaccine is coming, because there is still a ways to go. So I thank you both for being a part of this. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
How the vaccine will be distributed is a critical topic. A national vaccination effort is a huge undertaking. The logistics alone are extraordinary. But this public health effort is confronted with a sharply divided nation cut along both partisan and racial lines. Let's discuss the challenges and basic facts of how the vaccine will reach your community with our panelist. Dr. Virginia A. Kane, MD, Director of the Marion, Indiana County Public Health Department. She is an Associate Professor of Medicine at Indiana University School of Medicine's Infectious Disease Division. and Dr. Reed Tuckson. He is a founding member of the steering committee of the Black Coalition Against COVID and a former president of the Charles A. Drew University of Medicine and Science and former commissioner of public health for Washington, D.C. I thank you both for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. Dr. Tuckson, let me start with you. You serve also on the National Academy of Medicine's committee, and it's charged with making recommendations about the allocation of a safe and effective vaccine. Tell us a little bit about the recommendations that you've made to this point.
This is a very important committee, Ed, and it really set the groundwork for all of the federal and initiatives around the distribution of this vaccine. And the key thing that was uppermost in the mind of the committee was addressing the issue of health equity, of being fair. We were very cognizant of the fact that COVID has disproportionately affected people of color, and that the numbers of people of color who are being sickened, hospitalized, and dying is way in advance of any other sector in our society. And as a result, African-American people and other people of color were high in our list, making sure. Number two, we were very focused on being transparent about how the allocation decisions are being made. We were very attentive to whether or not our community would feel that once again, we were put on the back burner, that we were not going to be in line with others to be able to get it. We created several categories of priorities. Number one, of course, being the hospital workers, the healthcare system, people who are putting their lives on the line with the most sick of individuals every day. But right after them were people with multiple chronic illnesses. And we know that that is a very high area for our community, and that is why we put them there. And then we also made a very high priority for people that are doing essential work, the frontline people in our transportation system, our maintenance workers, and of course, people that are working in schools and our teachers. So what we ultimately did, Ed, is to make sure that our community would have access in a fair and righteous way to these life-saving vaccines. And we want to make sure that we as a community are going to hold our local governments accountable for making those fair distribution decisions.
I know one of the things you and I have talked about offline as we've moved to put these town halls together is the importance of convincing our community that you do have a watchdog, if you will, making sure that these things are going to be done right for us based on the historical data that we've seen and the history of mismanagement and, just outright chicanery, if you will, that was plagued with our society. Give me a sense of what you've been able to do there to try to reassure people who still have questions.
Well, what we're going to do is to really publicize these recommendations, and we're sending them to all of the healthcare workers that we can find across the country so they can use this as a checklist, as an advocacy tool when the decisions are being made at the local and state level. I am very concerned that there will be some jurisdictions, and my colleague will talk about those perhaps in a moment, but I'm very worried, Ed, that our communities will be once again cut out. So now we have from the National Academy of Medicine, the most prestigious organization in the country. We've got the guidance and the rule book that says what fairness looks like, and we're going to fight like heck to make sure that that fairness comes to life.
Dr. Kane, let me move directly to you with that question in terms of, local municipalities and the question, quite frankly, of whether or not this will be equally distributed based on your income and the like. Give me a sense of what local municipalities and organizations must do to make sure that this is equitable distribution.
So I think we have two issues. First, we need to highlight. One is vaccine hesitancy. So when you look at the Pew Research Center, they say that 71% of whites and Hispanics have stated that they're more likely to take this vaccine because of this very fast process. But when you look at African Americans, it's at about 54% in terms of vaccine hesitance. So a lot has to do with the trust of our people of color's community with our healthcare system. And as you know, unfortunately, we've had institutional racism, and I think we may talk a little bit more about that from the American Academy, but it's who you trust depends on their ability whether they're going to even want to take the vaccine. But part of our issues with institutional racism is we don't always have health care in the neighborhoods where we reside. So it makes it extremely difficult for them to access health care, especially because of maybe lack of education. You may have a language barrier or literacy based on your educational level and your different experiences that we receive for our providers. I can see in Marion County here in Indianapolis, we had significant numbers of people of color who tried to access testing and emergency room services, and they would be told, oh, you just got the flu or whatever, you stay at home. Unlike many of our white counterparts. And most of them later had the diagnosis of COVID-19, but couldn't even get tested. So what we have to do, we have to make sure that there's equitable distribution of this vaccine to people of color. And based on the number of cases that we've had overall in this country, they're making up almost 45% of the cases, they should be at a higher level of having the vaccines distributed to them compared to anyone else except for maybe our healthcare workers and possibly our seniors. And each state, how this is worked on, each state working with the Centers for Disease Control can make their own decisions about how the vaccines are distributed. So that's what makes it so complicated. It's not a standardized set of who's at risk and who gets the vaccine in the first phase, second phase, or third phase. And so fortunately for us in Indiana, we have phase 1A, phase B. So our phase 1A, these are our healthcare workers and our first responders. But phase B, any individual that has underlying medical conditions, chronic medical conditions, gets into that next phase for which a lot of our people of color will be in that group as the group right after our healthcare workers and first responders.
I saw Dr. Tuckson agreeing with you, and I wanted to ask him in terms of coming out of the gate. It seems to me that it's vital that you come out of the gate with the distribution being fair and equitable, because otherwise you're going to see people pull back, and this will be a failure if people don't engage in taking the vaccine. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's very fair. And and what's so important about your point, Ed, is that we know that it's going to take a long time for the vaccine to be manufactured in enough doses to be able to cover the whole country. And so we've got to start right out making sure that the most critically in need people will be able to get it. And as Dr. Kane just mentioned, those categories that she mentioned come right out of the National Academy of Medicine report that I was lucky enough to serve on. And so, Ed, I think that if we already, as you mentioned earlier, we're already anxious about whether we'll take the vaccine, but there'll be equally a number of people that will be upset if, in fact, a proven and safe vaccine is not available to us. So if we want to be able to gain that trust that Dr. Kane talks about, we've got to make sure that coming out of the gates, that we're getting in line and we have the first dibs at getting at this, not for experimentation, but for life-saving.
And yes, and it can really protect your family members and even your colleagues related to you having the availability of getting that vaccine early in order to give yourself protection 2 weeks later. And so you don't have to worry about, am I going to spread this infection to my children in my home? Or maybe my parents are living with us, because we have a lot of intergenerational housing. So we have families from grandmother, grandfather, down to the parents, down to the children, and even grandchildren a lot of times. And so we also have to look at, from a socioeconomic standpoint, of factors like, is there generational housing that makes you high risk? Or are you one of those vulnerable populations that, from a poverty standpoint, you can't get resources? These are our highest risk individuals that need to be in the forefront getting the vaccines.
Truth of the matter here, as we take a look down the road 4 or 5 months, is we're going to see a transition. In the Oval Office, we're going to see a sense of a change of direction, if you will. But that also means realistically that we're going to have to live through this winter, and the distribution of vaccine over any wide swatch of things won't occur until probably spring. That being said, how do we make sure that we are going to be able to reach those communities that Dr. Kane just talked about, those who are, unable to pay for this? We're hearing that this is going to be available for free to anyone who wants the vaccine. Are you comfortable with that being the case, Dr. Tuckson? Do you believe that's going to be the case?
I am very comfortable with that. One thing is an absolute certainty. You will not have to pay out of your pocket to get this vaccine. And if there's anybody who ever tries to sell you the vaccine, it's a scam and run in the opposite direction. I think the other point that you raised, though, and it's one of the great concerns that we are going through now with the transition period between the incoming Biden-Harris administration and Donald Trump. And that's that failure to communicate and allowing this transition to occur in an orderly way. I am livid that this would be happening because we need coherent planning now. And as you indicate, it will take over a long period of time. By the way, I must use this moment to remind everyone, if you are going to continue to think that everything will be solved by the vaccine, as important as it is, and you decide that you don't have to wear your mask or gather around the family gathering at Christmas time or whatever, this is not the year to do that. This is not the year to have family gatherings indoors, and it is definitely not the time not to wear your mask.
And Dr. Kane, should we not think of, when we talk about getting back to a sense of normalcy, we may not get back to, and I think this is something that people are going to have to embrace, we may not get back to the normal we knew. Our new normal may be different than what we knew prior to COVID. Is that fair?
I think that's fair to answer that. So look, we have 340 million Americans in this country, 340 million Americans. We are estimating that we may get as much as only 20 million vaccines by the end of December, end of 2020, 20 million.
Yeah, it's up to us. And it's also up to us to make sure that we understand, even those that we would believe to be educated enough to understand what's going on. I have personal friends who I question, some of their behavior through all of this. And I believe they should know better. And sometimes it's simply because it's what you want to do. And you find a way to justify it. Dr. Tuckson, let me ask you as a final thought to give a clarion call, if you will, to our community, what you'd like to see from us by means of moving forward and keeping us as safe as we can be.
Very simply, number one, we again continue to beg you to do the right thing about using your mask, social distancing, and all those things, and not gathering together indoors with groups, especially in this as the weather turns warmer. Number two, please know that no vaccine will be released to the American people that is not proven to be safe and effective. And there are Black physicians and researchers at every level of the approval process making sure that we got your back. And number three, as it is disseminated throughout the community, all of our community-based organizations, the National Urban League and all community organizations need to be advocates to make sure that we have legitimate access to safe, proven vaccines to save our lives, save our mamas, save our grandparents, save our kids, save us. Our lives are on the line. We've got to fight for our rights.
Well, I thank you both once again. So very important to get this vital information out. Thank you again. That's it for Making It Plain, our town hall on understanding the COVID vaccine. Thanks to the Black Coalition Against COVID and our panelists. And most of all, thanks to all of you for showing up. We'll overcome COVID together.
Hello, I'm back, and I'll be your host for the Q&A portion of our town hall. I hope you've enjoyed the program so far, and I invite you to stay with us as we answer your questions and also explore late-breaking developments on the COVID vaccine and its dissemination. Some of you have forwarded your questions to us during the show, so we'll start answering those right away. But others of you may want to submit your questions now, and we'll be looking forward to seeing what you want to learn more about and what your perspectives are. To participate, it's pretty easy to do. If you're not already watching through National Urban League's Facebook page, all you need to do is to go to that page, which is easy to find. It's facebook.com/Nat Urban League. That's facebook.com/NATURBANLEAGUE. We'll look forward to seeing you over on Facebook in just a moment.